When you think of Vikings, what comes to mind? Fearsome warriors, epic longships, and maybe a certain god of thunder, right? But there's a much darker, often overlooked side to the Viking Age. It's a story of brutality, a story of what happened to those who were on the receiving end of a Viking raid. Today, we were going to peel back the layers of legend and look at the grim reality faced by Viking captives, a fate some considered worse than death. The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th to the late 11th centuries, was defined by expansion. But this expansion wasn't just about exploration. It was fueled by raids. From the coasts of England to the rivers of Russia, Viking longships brought terror. They weren't just after gold and silver. They were after people. Captives were one of the most valuable commodities they could acquire. Historians believe that for every Viking warrior, there might have been 2 or 3 enslaved people in their society. This wasn't a minor part of their world. It was a cornerstone of their economy and social structure. So, what happened when the longships appeared on the horizon for coastal communities? It was a nightmare. The raids were swift and brutal. Vikings targeted monasteries, towns, and farmsteads places with wealth and, more importantly, people. The strong and healthy were the prime targets. Men, women, and children were rounded up, bound, and marched back to the ships. Resistance was often met with immediate death. For those taken, this was just the beginning of a terrifying journey. Imagine being torn from your home, your family scattered or killed before your eyes. You're shackled and thrown into the crowded, filthy hull of a longship. The journey across the North Sea was perilous. Many captives didn't even survive the trip, succumbing to disease, starvation, or the harsh conditions. But for those who did, their ordeal was far from over. They were sailing towards a new life. A life of complete subjugation. Upon arriving in Scandinavia or a Viking trading hub like Dublin or Hedeby, the captives were sorted and sold like livestock. These slave markets were bustling, cruel places. People were inspected, their teeth checked, their strength assessed. Families were permanently torn apart. A child might be sold to one master, their mother to another, never to see each other again. The price of a person varied. A healthy young man skilled in a craft like blacksmithing was worth a fortune. A young woman might be sold for her looks. An old or infirm person was worth very little. In Old Norse, these enslaved people were called thralls. Their lives were entirely at the mercy of their masters. Legally, they were property. A master could beat, abuse, or even kill a thrall with no legal consequences. Their existence was one of endless, back-breaking labor. Male thralls toiled in the fields, built long houses and ships, and served their masters in every conceivable way. They were the invisible workforce that powered the Viking Age. For female thralls, life was often a double burden. In addition to domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, weaving, and raising their masters' children, they were subjected to constant sexual exploitation. They had no right to refuse their master, and any children born from this abuse were also considered thralls, born into the same life of servitude. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows a stark difference in health and nutrition between the Viking free and the thralls, with thralls often showing signs of malnutrition and a life of hard labor. But being a thrall wasn't always a life sentence. Though freedom was rare and difficult to achieve, a thrall could sometimes buy their freedom if they managed to save money. But how could they, when they owned nothing? A master might also grant a thrall freedom for exceptional service, or it might be stipulated in their will. But even a freed thrall, known as a lesingi, was not truly free. They still owed loyalty and certain obligations to their former master and their family. Their social status was forever marked by their past. Now, let's talk about some of the more infamous and ritualistic forms of violence associated with the Vikings. You've probably heard of the blood eagle. This brutal execution ritual, described in Norse sagas, is the stuff of nightmares. The victim's back was supposedly carved open, their ribs severed from the spine, and their lungs pulled out to create a pair of wings. Historians are fiercely divided on whether this actually happened or if it was just a literary invention, a way for saga writers to portray the ultimate act of vengeance and cruelty. There's no definitive archaeological proof of the blood eagle. But whether it was real or symbolic, its story tells us a lot about the Viking perception of honor, shame, and retribution. It was reserved for the most hated enemies, a way to utterly humiliate them in both life and death. The very idea of it was a powerful psychological weapon. Another terrifying fate was being used in a ship burial. High-status Vikings were sometimes buried in a ship, surrounded by their most valuable possessions for the journey to the afterlife. Sometimes those possessions included people. Sagas and archaeological finds, like the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, suggest that thralls, particularly female ones, were sacrificed to accompany their masters into the next world. The famous Arab traveler, Ibn Fadlan, described a Rus Viking ship burial on the Valga River, where a slave girl volunteered to be sacrificed. But his description makes it clear this was anything but voluntary. She was drugged, assaulted, and then brutally killed by a ritual leader known as the Angel of Death. It's a chilling account that shows the absolute power masters held over their thralls, even in death. But Vikings didn't just keep captives for labor or ritual. They were also a key part of their strategy of war and diplomacy. High-status captives, like nobles or royalty, could be ransomed for enormous sums of money. This was a much more profitable venture than simply killing them on the battlefield. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is filled with accounts of English kingdoms paying Danegeld massive tributes to get the Vikings to leave, and this often included ransoming important hostages. These captives were held in Viking camps, their fate hanging in the balance as negotiations took place. The psychological pressure on their home kingdoms was immense. The legacy of Viking slavery is vast and complex. It dramatically changed the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe. Genetic studies have shown Scandinavian DNA spread far and wide, but a significant portion of female lineage in places like Iceland and the Faroe Islands actually comes from the British Isles. This strongly suggests that Viking men settled these new lands with female captives taken from their raids. They weren't just visitors. They were colonizers who built a new society on the backs of an enslaved population. Over time, as Viking societies converted to Christianity and integrated more with mainland Europe, the institution of slavery began to change. The church condemned the enslavement of fellow Christians, though the practice didn't disappear overnight. It slowly evolved into forms of serfdom, more common in medieval Europe. The great slave markets of the Viking world eventually faded away. So, when we celebrate the adventurous spirit of the Vikings, it's crucial to remember the full picture. Their world was built on a foundation of violence and exploitation that victimized countless people. The story of the Viking Age isn't just one of warriors and explorers. It's also the story of the thralls, the unnamed, unfree people whose forced labor built their halls, whose stolen lives funded their expeditions, and whose suffering is an inseparable part of their legacy. It's a dark, brutal, and essential piece of history that deserves to be told. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey into the darker side of the Viking Age interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time.